Well, welcome everybody. My name is Susan Tussey, and I'm responsible for communications and outreach here at Globus. And today with me, I have Joe Baudeliero, who's going to be presenting on Globus SDK for JavaScript. He is a senior software engineer at Globus. And Joe, you can take it away.
Perfect. Thanks, Susan. Today we're going to be talking about the Globus SDK for JavaScript, and this is a bit of an extension of a lot of the presentations that were done at Globus World, which happened last week. There's a lot of great presentations and conversations there, so I definitely recommend checking out the keynotes once they're published. But we got a lot of content to cover today within the SDK, so I'm going to jump right in. Once my slides update. Of course, there we go. So today we're going to be taking a look at JavaScript as a whole at Globus. I'm going to talk a bit about the SDK itself and dive into some core concepts. I've got a couple of use cases that I'm going to share with you all, and then I definitely want to leave as much time as possible for some Q&A at the end. So let's start with talking a bit about JavaScript at Globus and just more generally the ecosystem that we see JavaScript playing a role at Globus. So you might have seen this graphic before, and really what this graphic intends to convey is what the JavaScript ecosystem at Globus is and how we're working on building it up. Obviously, the base of the ecosystem is the platform itself. So this includes transfer, auth, flows, all the service APIs, and related clients. So Globus Connect Personal, Globus Connect Server, and their related service APIs. Where the JavaScript ecosystem really begins is the Globus SDK for JavaScript. And this is intended to be essentially a convenience layer for interacting with the Globus platform. The main idea here is just to give folks an easy way to interact with all these different services that we have within the Globus platform. The next tier is user interface components. And these are seen as reusable components for creating familiar user experiences for common interactions with Globus. A good example of this is finding a path and a collection within Globus. So internally, that's an experience we want to make sure is familiar and users understand when they see. And so what we're thinking is externally, we also want to expose those same components to give your applications a way to use those common interactions. This is definitely something we're still working on and trying to figure out the best way to both share those components and structure them to accommodate as many use cases as possible. So it's definitely a future state, but it's something that we see as part of the whole JavaScript ecosystem. And then finally, we have solutions that are the top of the pyramid here. And these are things that we see as more off-the-shelf solutions to the more common interactions within research data management. And so these are things like pre-generated portals for data distribution, data discovery, things where maybe your team isn't coding up entire solutions on their own. Instead, you're grabbing pieces that an entire application that we've put together that solves a specific need in the data research realm. But today, we're going to be focusing primarily on the SDK for JavaScript. I'll definitely touch on some of the other things and some of the use case examples, but really today I want to make sure we go over the SDK pretty in depth. So talking about the SDK at a high level, just a few things that I want to call out. The SDK itself is platform and framework agnostic, which just means that we're aiming for the widest support possible. We really want to make sure that, if you're using Node, if you're using Vue, you're using React, if you're using vanilla JavaScript, you have a way to integrate with the Globus platform in a really convenient way. One of the other things that's important to us has also been TypeScript support. So over the past couple of years, we've actually transitioned our web application to use TypeScript. And it's been a really, really great thing that we've added. And it's helped us solve a lot of bugs. Some bugs we weren't even aware of, some bugs that we were aware of, but were made easier to fix by moving to TypeScript. And so we want to be able to offer that as part of the JavaScript SDK package as well. So that we're essentially offering first-class TypeScript support. And a lot of those types come from the service APIs themselves. So some of our APIs, as you may know, expose Open API. versions of their services. And so we actually parse those open API scripts and generate some types from those. We also do handcraft some of those types. So, and what reasons why we do that is based on how we've been interacting with those services and what we've found useful based on those generated types, which kind of leads into this third point, that it is built by Globus. So it's something that not only have we built, but we're also using day to day. And so when you're using the SDK, you're getting a lot of institutional knowledge for integrating with the platform in different ways. Finally, it is open source. And really, I just wanted to highlight this because one of the things we want to make sure we're doing with the SDK JavaScript ecosystem as a whole is really we're just trying to match the same commitment that we've made to the Python community over the past years. And really the SDK and all of this ecosystem work that we're doing is just the beginning of that. So now I want to talk specifics about some core functionality within the SDK. We'll dive a little deep and then we can definitely come back to this during the Q&A if there are questions here. Zoom out a little more. But basically, there's three things that I want to make sure we cover in this conversation. When I talk about the common interfaces for interacting with the Globus platform and how we structured those, I want to talk about some of the utilities and constants that are being exposed through the SDK and really talk about kind of where that's headed. And then I want to talk about simplified authorization and consent management. So these are really at a high level, the three things that we really see the SDK solving for folks. And so we're going to dive into them. So starting with the common interfaces, the first goal of the SDK is really to reduce boilerplate and make interacting with the Globus platform more obvious in your applications. And so the one way we do that is by providing common interfaces to the various resources and service methods. So here I have an example of importing the transfer service from the SDK. So the core export or the main export of the SDK exports all the services. And here I am making a call to fetch a single task. So the full call is transfer task get. The idea here is all these resources map to their CRUD operations or HTTP methods. So if I want to fetch a single resource, I'm calling the get method. If I want to fetch a list of resources, I call the get all method. And this hopefully looks like, and intentionally should look like, a lot of the different RESTful-based SDKs you might have already been using. Another good example is the GitHub REST API. There's a bunch of others out there, but the idea is that we want to make it very predictable how to use the SDK, especially when interacting with the platform itself. So this naming schema really only applies to the CRUD-like methods that map really well to HTTP verbs. So get all, create, update, patch, and remove. But there definitely are some cases where we have to map to how the resource is named. And so these are cases where the endpoint itself doesn't necessarily match the CRUD aspect or HTTP verb. It might be a more RPC-like method, or it might be a very specific sort of service method that we need to integrate with. And so in these cases, the SDK takes the approach of just using the documented name. So a good example of this is ls. I believe the ls call winds up making a get under the hood, but the way that you would interact with that within the SDK is transfer file operations ls. Another good example would be make dir. This is a very specific operation in transfer. So the idea is that you can use the same structure of transfer file operations make dir to reflect that RPC-like method. Another good example is task submission. I believe task submission within transfer submits a post. And so the idea of the call being transfer task submission submit transfer works out well because it doesn't necessarily align to those CRUD operations one-to-one. To submit a delete, it's actually a submit delete call. All of these interfaces are documented within our type doc generation or generated type doc. And really, they're intended to, again, match the documentation within the services and make them easy and predictable as far as how you use them. The signatures of these interfaces are meant to be very, very similar, and they are exactly the same where possible. And the structures themselves and signatures themselves return a promise that resolve native fetch API response objects. We're really trying to lean into native and primitive types with the SDK with the idea of portability in mind, and also expandability and composition. In the case of fetch specifically, we want to make sure that we're giving you access to the fetch object that's created. So one of the things we do is all in the SDK is that all these signatures take a tail argument that allows you to pass options to the fetch call. And then all of these signatures also take the same argument shape for passing query headers and payloads. We call this the service method options, which I'll show an example. So these are two methods shown from the SDK. I'm showing the transfer service in both of these cases. So that first method is using the transfer endpoint get. So we're fetching a single resource. Now, obviously, since we're fetching a single resource, we need the ID of that resource. So that becomes the first argument. That second argument that you're seeing there, that the object that's being passed with the query property, that's the service method options. So there, I can pass query. I can pass fields for this specific endpoint to return a subset of fields. If this endpoint also took in a filter query param, I could pass that as a property there as well. And so that structure and this sort of shape is the same across all the service methods. To show that in another example, the file operations, which I mentioned is more RPC-like, takes the same structure. So the ls call, because we're doing an ls on a single collection, obviously requires the ID of that collection as the first argument, but then that service method options object is the same shape. So the query property is going to be set as query params. In this example, I'm also sending along headers to go with the request. And in cases of post or put requests, I could actually send a payload as well. But obviously, in both of these cases, these are GET requests, so I don't have examples of those there. One of the other core pieces of functionality within the SDK that we want to be able to provide, in addition to common interfaces, are utilities and constants. Here, I'm showing an example of the connector constants that we're exposing through the SDK. This is a great example where in our web application, we're faced a lot with surfacing information about the different storage gateways within Globus. We've traditionally done that by having effectively a constant in the web application that maps the IDs to their different types, so we can do things like translations or show icons. This was something that we deemed useful, not only internally, but also externally. So we've added to the SDK as a constant. And so these types of things we're definitely going to keep working on within the web app, graduating from the web application and some of our other web properties and moving them to the SDK so external parties can use it just as easily. The storage gateway information is a great example. Another good example is our error handling. The current SDK has some good error handlers that you can pass in an object and it tries to tell you what error shape that object is. It's even more powerful if you're using TypeScript because all those checks act as type guards as well. But you don't have to use TypeScript to use those same utilities and methods. The idea is that you can still get some value out of using them in any context. The third thing I want to make sure to highlight about the SDK today is the authorization manager. It's definitely probably one of the more complex pieces when integrating your application with the Globus platform. So it's something we really want to try to solve in an elegant way, again, for both your application and ours. And so in our 3.0 tag, we've added a new authorization manager. And really what we see the authorization manager intending to solve is provide full management of an authorization context when interacting with Globus. So that means taking care of the OAuth handshake for you, It does this via Pixie, lifecycle management of those tokens, and taking care of common errors that you see when interacting with Globus resources. Great example of this is consent required when you need an additional access scope to do an LS on a collection, or maybe you're working with HA collections where you need to prompt people to sign in after a certain amount of time. We want to try to make this easy for your application to react to these states by sharing code that we've been using in the web application to develop these features. So diving into the authorization manager, this is how you create an authorization manager and what you need to create an authorization manager. The authorization utility is exposed through the SDK main export. It's one of the few things outside of services that we deem a core piece of the SDK that we don't export. And what you need to create an authorization manager is a client ID, which is the client ID from your application that's registered with Globus Auth. The registration of an application is definitely outside the context of this conversation, but we have some great documentation available for how to get started and get that client ID in our documentation and linked here, which will be distributed after. In addition to the client ID, you need the route of the application, or the route of your application where the authorization grant flow will be handled. I'm going to show a full diagram of this handshake and what this looks like. But a lot of times this is just the same route where you're creating the manager, or maybe you have a specific route where you're handling the redirect back from the OAuth authorization, like a /login or /authorize. So just the URL where you're going to complete that OAuth handshake. And finally, if your application requires additional scopes, which it likely does, you pass those scopes as a property. Space separated property takes the same shape of arguments, so and structure of arguments as auth does for the scope strings. So I want to talk a little bit specifically about the OAuth flow and how the SDK tries to simplify this for your application. And so what we're looking at here is the abstract protocol flow from the OAuth spec itself. We are looking at just the general flow. I mentioned we use Pixie, so one thing's not shown here. There's a separate chart that explicitly states where the code challenge occurs. So that's not in this diagram, but where that would occur is within the authorization grant itself. So using this diagram, I'm going to basically talk through how the authorization manager takes care of the handshake for you. So the first step, when you create your manager instance, the first thing you're going to do to log a user in is call login. So once you call this, the manager is going to take the configuration and use Globus Auth as the resource, as the authorization grant resource owner, which just means that it's going to redirect to auth and ask the user to log in or start the handshake if they're already logged in. Once auth gets that request, and again, we're using Pixie, so we've sent some state, we have some state stored to actually understand the return request. Once the user has done their action on Globus Auth, so logged in, the redirect back to your application is going to be handled by this manager method called handle code redirect. What this is going to do is it's going to look at the URL, see if there's a code challenge, and then actually process that code challenge, making the request back to Globus Auth to exchange it for a token, and then store that token in the manager itself. Once that token is stored within the manager, then you can use that token to interact with the rest of Globus services. The manager itself will store tokens by resource. So if you request multiple tokens in that initial login, say you request a token for transfer and flows, you'll be able to reference those by resource server name or by some helpful getters within the manager itself to just be able to grab the token you need based on the service you're interacting with. So a few different use cases to talk about really quickly of how we're using the SDK to give you an idea of one, how we use it day to day and what's possible with the SDK. Within the Globus web application, so the web app is actually built with Ember.js and Node.js. We're using it as the HTTP layer for the majority of requests to Globus services. So anytime we're communicating with transfer, flows, compute, we're doing that through the SDK. One of the other ways we're using the SDK within our, not within our application, but within our stack, is we actually use it within our test suite to scaffold some data within non-production environments. This helps us create tests and a test suite that we can reliably run in our continuous integration environments. And it's just, again, a simple way to interact with the Globus platform through JavaScript. So that being a great example of maybe a way to use this in a scripting context as opposed to an application context. And then, like I mentioned before, we've moved to TypeScript in the past couple of years. We make heavy use of the types and the utilities throughout. I mentioned those type guards within those utilities. It's been really great using those to clean up a lot of code and, again, address bugs that we might have known existed and bugs we might not even known existed based on those types being as strict as possible. Another use case where we're using the SDK and we really are starting to grow the usage is in our data distribution portal. This was mentioned again within Globus world. This is actually a application that's written in the Next.js, so it's using React, and this uses really the SDK for every aspect of interacting with Globus. So it uses it completely for authorization management. So it's really taking advantage of that authorization manager, and then all interactions with Globus auth and transfer. So the application itself will perform an LS and perform a transfer similar to our file browser, but much more simplified and smaller. But the interactions occurring there are all happening through the SDK itself. I mentioned before the user interface components tier of the JavaScript ecosystem. This is a great example where we're really trying to figure out how can we use those to accomplish, solutions like this, and then not only accomplish them for us, but also be able to share those things. If one of the things I want to make sure to point out, our web application being Ember and this application being React, there is a challenge there of, how can we make something that is useful in all of these contexts where we're not being prescriptive about what framework we're using. So we are looking at things like native web components and libraries that help build native web components. But again, something we're still kind of building out and working toward. So really briefly looking ahead and what we're working on and intend to work on, we really want to hear from the community as far as what is needed in your JavaScript applications. So we're definitely building the SDK based on our experience within the web app and what we need and what we found successful. But if there are specific needs from you, we want to hear from you. One of the ways to do that, the GitHub repo does have issues, so it's great to post issues there. If you want to reach out more directly, or you don't want to reach out, have a issue or information publicly available, you can always reach out to support@globus.org to reach our team. One of the things that we know we're continuing to expand and we want to provide are expanded examples and documentation. And this is another one where I think hearing from you all what would be helpful as far as what types of examples you want to see, whether that's specific frameworks or interactions with specific services. We want to be able to try to provide that for you all. So getting some understanding about what challenges you're seeing when you are using the SDK or what examples would help would be very, very helpful. And then finally, continuing down this path of enhancing the authorization management. One of the things the authorization manager doesn't do right now is handling background token refreshing. There's a couple other things that we also know we want to be able to address. So one of the things that has come up is potentially offering additional transports. So the idea of maybe not forcing a user to redirect, maybe doing a handshake in the background or through a pop-up. So these are all things that we are investigating and we want to look to enhance the authorization management a bit with. But again, a lot of these enhancements are just going to come from the users of the SDK itself, and that will really drive our roadmap. So I'll pause here and want to answer some questions if there are any. I have the chat open. I don't see any in the chat, but if anybody has any questions, I would be happy to answer them. Rick, I see your hand raised.
Hi. Obviously, this is something that I'm very excited about, and I really appreciate the example you provided. And I don't know if I'm channeling just a very anecdotal personal experience, but as I mentioned at Globus World, I think for a lot of us in the research computing side, our experience with either compiled or interpreted languages, I'm thinking C, Python, Fortran, and stuff like that. JavaScript and TypeScript is a new realm. And getting up to speed with it is, it's another language, but it's a different paradigm. If you are willing to provide examples or references for what kind of things should we go read and learn without having to take a full class, there's the head first books that I used for HTML and CSS, but that is being revised. And basically, what kind of tutorials or materials with particular components, JavaScript, TypeScript, maybe React or Node, it would be worth referring to so that we could make the most use of this? I think it would be appreciated, but again, that could be very personal and anecdotal. The examples, of course, are huge.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, and I think it is something that I am definitely thinking about, and I want us to be able to assist in, because I also acknowledge that JavaScript in the research realm is really just there's not a lot of usage of it. It is a lot of Python and a lot of other languages, and so I think I do think there. I mentioned the examples we have, and so we have one example that is a very, very basic HTML integration, but then we also have those data distribution portals that are definitely more advanced, that are it uses React, it has a React context, which is likely going to be probably down the line in your learning experience of building out a web application using JavaScript. So I think our role there, I definitely personally, I want to help at an individual level, try to help with the understanding there and how we can provide help that, or how we can assist in that understanding. I think, yeah, it's a challenge, and I think it definitely will be very individual in how we solve that. But if good things come out of those conversations, as far as, hey, this was really useful. I came from a Python background, but this clarified things for me of how to use the SDK. I want to make those things available publicly. So yeah, I think it's going to take conversations, and also maybe some trial and error of what good examples are and what they should be to reach this audience. So.
Thanks, Joe. Are there any other questions?
Right.
Yeah, I have a question. So, what kind of examples are currently available on the JavaScript SDK?
Yeah, so in our repo, you'll find a link to the examples, and we have a very basic example that will handle login and a LS against a Globus collection, which is often the most common sort of interaction that people kind of start with. That example it's intended to be very, very basic, and again, it's using vanilla JS, only using HTML. So that example exists. The more in-depth example would be the data distribution portal, which is on top of the LS, actually triggering a transfer. It also handles, traversing directories, We're working on adding the ability to make directories, but that entire code base is open source and is referenced in those examples as well. And then we also have a second portal that is more tuned to search and discovery. And so that's actually interacting with our search service. And again, it's a bit more advanced in that it uses React, and it uses some different components and structure to actually create the portal itself, but interacts with different services within the Globus ecosystem.
And so the portals are in TypeScript or JavaScript?
The portals are in TypeScript, so they use TypeScript as much as I can. There's probably some files in there that are JavaScript based, but for the majority, they're using TypeScript.
Okay. Yeah, I think it would be nice to have a simple example in TypeScript so that we can see the difference between using vanilla JavaScript and TypeScript. And also it'd be great to have some intermediate examples that they start to do something more complicated, but without going to a full-fledged portal. That would be really helpful to have. Thank you.
Yeah, okay, definitely. And I think one of the things we probably don't do well right now is more programmatic or like script access using the SDK. A lot of the examples we have are definitely UI based, but it sounds like maybe having some TypeScript specific ones that sort of show both, or JavaScript specific ones show both, would be useful. So that's definitely something we'll take a look at. Thank you.
Yeah, but by experience, I see a lot of times it's much easier to start from an example than to go read the docs and try to do something. And so, yeah, it would be really helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, no, definitely. I totally agree. Perfect. So we covered some questions. I had a couple of canned just in case we needed to talk about them, but we are a little bit over on time. So TypeScript isn't required. Follow updates on the GitHub repository. We publish releases through NPM and GitHub. It's the best place to kind of see the activity and what we're working on. Full changelog in the repository, and I mentioned reporting issues. The other thing I want to make sure to mention, we've got a couple upcoming talks. They're not scheduled yet, but in this vein of JavaScript ecosystem, JavaScript SDK, and kind of what comes next. We got at least 2 talks scheduled, not scheduled, but planned. We're going to do a deep dive into creating a basic application with the SDK. This is going to be more hands-on, so we'll actually get into an editor and create an application live. And then I mentioned the data distribution portal being more of a solution and kind of off-the-shelf solution. We'll do another presentation where we actually go from nothing to having that portal configured with your collection, a new application. And we'll try to do that in another 10 minutes. I think my record speed is about 5, so I added a little buffer based on how good I am at estimating. So. But yeah, we definitely plan to have more conversations about JavaScript within the research community and Globus as a whole. So look for those.
Great. Thank you all for joining, and we will let you know about the exact dates for these upcoming talks. And thank you, Joe, for a great presentation.
Thanks.